All right, I'll start by introducing. I'm Ben. I'm the pastor of Howard Memorial Presbyterian Church here in Tarboro. My folks know who I am, but for those folks at Dunn and Bluff, and then also grateful to have Dave Zahl, the author of Low Anthropology, with us. So I'll turn it over and let others introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'll go next. I think everybody probably know. A lot of people know me. I'm Howard Dudley, child of Howard Memorial Presbyterian Church in Tarboro, husband to the pastor at Bluff Presbyterian Church, and the one of the pastors here at First Presbyterian Church in Dunn. And I'm real excited to have this conversation. I think this is going to be great.
I'm Elizabeth McGuire. I'm serving in the function essentially as associate pastor with Howard Dudley at First Pres in Dunn and the focus of Christian education. I've been there for about a year and working on a part-time basis, but have been introduced to the beauty and depth of a discussion on anthropology and theology through this book and all things considered with the mocking cast and all that. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. And I guess we should let our esteemed guest, author, podcaster, preacher extraordinaire, Dave Zahl, introduce himself. How do you introduce yourself, people?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same question.
Well, I say thank you for having me here. I'm glad to be able to be a part of this. I'm Dave Zahl, and I wrote this book that we're talking about today. And I live in we're recording this, or I'm sitting in Central Virginia, in Charlottesville, Virginia, not too far away from you guys, but a little up the road. And I serve, as well as I run Mockingbird Ministries and all, sort of oversee what we do. But I also serve on the staff of Christ Episcopal Church here in Charlottesville. So yeah, and then those are where our offices are located. Yeah, and let me think. I have 3 boys. I'm married to a wonderful, beautiful artist named Kate, and you could see I collect action figures, which is a lot. So thank you for tolerating the visual distraction.
That's awesome. It might be good, since we got 3 churches that are going to be watching this, like, just to kind of tell everybody where this idea came from before we jump in. But basically Ben and myself and Meg, started a conversation about this book back in the fall, and we really all loved the book and thought, wouldn't it be awesome if we could do something with this? And the themes of the book lend themselves pretty well to the themes of Lent, and so we thought we would maybe kind of sit down and try to explore a little bit on how we could use the book for Lent in our congregation. So all 3 of our churches are doing what we're calling Low Anthropology Lent. We're all kind of doing different things with it. There's some Sunday school classes, there's some Wednesday night dinners and Lenten lectures, there's Bible studies that we're offering for men's circles and women's circles. So lots of different things that we're doing with the book. But we all thought it'd be great if we could just get together and find a time to just kind of hear from the author and pick your brain, Dave. And so we're grateful to have some time to do that. So I'll kick this off. So one thing is, when I've been promoting the book to people in our church and just kind of saying, hey, this is what we're going to do, I always have to find a way to just kind of a quick elevator pitch to explain it. So, like, what's your kind of elevator pitch for Low Anthropology? Like, what do we actually mean by this?
Well, depends on how long the elevator ride is.
Take it as long as you need, I guess.
30 seconds to a minute, but if you need more, you go. You do you.
We're graceful people.
Okay, good. When people ask me what the book's about, I say it's about how limitation and weakness actually are the doorway to compassion and unity. And that understanding of human nature, that has an enormous bearing, the way that you understand limitation and weakness has enormous bearing on how you treat other people and yourself. So if I'm talking to someone who I know is like a churchgoer and has a sort of a Christian background, I could say it's an attempt to be a lighthearted but penetrating introduction to why someone would be interested in God in the first place, or it's outlining what a Christian understanding of human nature. So I could go into any number of things. I like someone, when I was going around to speak about this book, they said what the book really is, it should have been called How Not to Hate People. So that's I wrote a book about how not to hate people. That's from and I'm drawing on the resources that I have from my faith to give an answer, or at least put in some input into that conversation, because there's so much antagonism and blame and derision that goes on.
Did you find out about the potential name change too late? Because I think that would be like a bestseller, don't you think? I mean, How Not to Hate People.
Yeah, I mean,
I don't know. I'm not a book publisher, as we talked about earlier.
I'm a man that's full of many regrets. That's part of what it means to have a low anthropology. So it's a mouthful to say my book is called Low Anthropology, and that sounds kind of scientific or highfalutin in some way, but it's just an anthropology is simply what we mean by what's our operating view of human nature, what we mean when we say I'm only human. Like that's it. Everyone's got an anthropology. There's cultural anthropology, which is like what college classes are about, and the study of tribes in Nicaragua or something like that. But the anthropology, the way philosophers and theologians use it, is actually as a shorthand. It's actually as a shortening, as a way to say human beings, human nature. So, but I know it was a risk. Ben, when I titled it this. But I think sometimes like it's a little fresh vocabulary can be helpful to us, even if it's describes something we already know. It just you feel like you've gained something, and maybe a fresh way of language is important. So I think people think about things slightly differently if you use some different wording.
Yeah. How do you?
I want to reiterate, I actually really like the title, and it's been helpful in the class that we've been using, as I was telling you earlier. So
good.
One thing about that class,
too late to change. It's a theoretical question.
That is a theoretical question.
One thing about the class, Ben, you've shared, and I've even heard people from that Sunday school class say things like, "Oh man, I'm having a high anthropology day." So I mean, people are reading the book, but just real quick, give us a distinction between high anthropology and low anthropology. I thought the Steve Jobs and Lamont quotes did a really great job of illustrating that, but how do you draw that distinction out?
Yeah, I think so anthropology, I charted on a continuum of high to low. High is sort of the more ambitious understandings of human nature. And like I quote Steve Jobs, like graduation speeches always are like treatises on anthropology. They're always sort of like, this is what it means to be a person. This is what it means to be a good person. This is how you do this. There's so many assumptions that go into graduation speeches, and some are amazing for that reason. And some are just like greeting cards, and like everyone sort of rolls their eyes a little bit. But Steve Jobs, in a famous speech to Stanford, I think 2005, he said something like, have the courage to follow your intuition wherever it goes. You already know what it is you truly want to become. And it's this sort of slightly, I mean, it's inspiring, especially if you hear Steve Jobs say it, understanding of like there's being some inborn compass that's going to lead me in the right direction, and the goal of life is to filter out all the sort of noise. But that's an example of a high anthropology, because it assumes a level of kind of agency or freedom and simply conflict-free goodness that is not really in sync, I think, with people's experience of themselves. And Anne Lamott famously said, everyone is screwed up, broken, clingy, and scared, even those people who seem to have it more or less together. They're far more like you than you would care to believe. So try not to compare your insides with their outsides. And that, she's articulating a low anthropology. And the way that people hear that, while it sounds like maybe a negative judgment, when you hear that as a person, you feel your shoulders unknot, I think, because so many of us go around thinking we're the only one for whom life is difficult. We're the only one who can't seem to get our act together, the only one barely hanging on. So that's the distinction. High anthropology is sort of optimistic. It's sunny. It's over, and I would say a little Pollyanna, and low anthropology is not the same as sort of darkness. Low anthropology is, I would call, sobriety. It's more, it's honesty, and it's a transparency, and it
like
is
maybe not cynicism, but
it's not cynicism. Cynicism is the fruit of high anthropology, which says I can know for certain about this person or this issue, and I can, before something's already happened, I could tell you it's going to be terrible. You know, that's cynicism, and that's sort of certainty, that kind of comprehension, that sort of 100% mastery. And as a Christian, I believe that that's only available to God. For me, as a compromised person who's a creature, rather than, you know, there's a God and it's not me, you know, I can only know the truth partially, or in a kind of a incomplete way. I'm bound by context. I'm bound by time. I'm bound by my, you know, what I ate for dinner last night before. So cynicism assumes a kind of access to full truth and unassailable certainty that a low anthropology always says you actually don't know for certain, which means you're frequently surprised.
All right, I got a two-part question and follow-up, and this is, you alluded to it just a second ago, and it's how, I think it's exactly how you start your book with is it a cartoon of like people walking around and they all have the little bubbles above their heads? The first question is, do you have that cartoon?
I do have that cartoon.
And
I have it digitally. It's an actual cartoon. It's not a fake.
Okay. No, I just want that to be like right above you. Like, I loved the way that started. So the question this is the follow-up question is, so you explained low anthropology, high anthropology. So the question that we are wrestling with, and I would imagine our congregants are wrestling with, is why do you think we try to avoid that low anthropology? And why, so kind of a two-parter too, is why do you think we want to take a higher view of ourselves and others? So that's the kind of question.
Well, let me say the cartoon that you're alluding to it was inspirational and foundational in the writing of the book. It's of a bunch of people on a city street, like no one's talking to each other. It's all sorts of different people, and they're going in different directions, but they're all thinking the exact same thing. They have like little thought bubbles going up to the sky. And the thought is, everyone really seems to have it together, but I still have no idea what's going on. And it's this sort of universal, it's a picture of people united in their confusion and their kind of impostership. You know, that's today's word is imposter syndrome. And there was a great article that was just published 2 weeks ago in the New Yorker by Leslie Jameson, who looked into the sort of roots of imposter syndrome. And it was actually coined as a phenomenon that high achieving professional women in the 80s, there was papers written about particularly that sort of experience of feeling like you didn't belong. And that's been extrapolated over the years into all sorts of other arenas. And it turns out it's not really a syndrome. It's everyone kind of feels this way at some right. points. And that you feel like if people only knew, that I've somehow managed to pull one over on folks. Why do we avoid it though? Well, it's not flattering. I think that we gravitate towards understandings of the human condition that flatter us and that give us a sense of control. See, I think low anthropology views human beings as very much addicted to control, personal control. I think I see that in the Bible, from the Garden of Eden onward, that we want to be God. You know, that's the diagnosis there. And to the extent that I want to be the director of the play, and everyone else is an actor in that play. And there's a great passage in the AA's big book, I think, where it talks about, imagine the chaos would ensue on a dramatic production if everyone thought they were the director and no one was an actor. And that we want that. We want the control that promises. So if we are truly compulsively like gravitate towards personal control, well, then we want to have a view of human nature ascribed that tells us we sort of have it within ourselves to change ourselves, to save ourselves, to simply, you know, pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps. That to us sounds like hope. The experience of that is usually the opposite. The experience of that is that, like, I was told that this would be easy and then it wasn't, or I was told that I just had to try hard enough and I would get to the top of the ladder, but then all sorts of other things happened. It turns out I have a tendency for self-sabotage, or it turns out there's a broken system here at play that is keeping me from climbing any higher. And you run into all sorts of obstacles. A low anthropology would say that you have enormous gifts you've been given, and there's a interplay within yourself that's conflicted, and so that, like, you have patience for other people, realizing that they are also subject to the same forces as you are, and knowing that any chance you get to exercise your gifts is like is a wonderful, exciting thing, rather than the expectation it should always be that way. Right. So I think a high anthropology sets people up for resentment of themselves as well as others. A low anthropology sets us up for amazement, gratitude, wonder at the fact that there is so much beauty, so much goodness, and so much fun things we get to be involved in, given what human nature is actually like, as I can tell you from human history, or my own history. That's probably a long-winded way of saying it's painful, I think, to discover that you don't have as much control as you thought you did. That's a painful experience, and we want to avoid pain at all costs. I think we're pain avoiders, so naturally we want to gravitate towards things that promise us that we can avoid pain if we just do X, Y, and Z. Low anthropology says pain is going to happen, and the question is, whether is God present in that pain or not? Like, and a low anthropology, which I believe goes hand in glove with a high Christology or a high theology. I think you believe that if God's not present in pain, what is he present in? You know, like, it's there's a real hopeful posture towards the difficulties we encounter, that God uses our setbacks and our mistakes and our failures in our lives in all sorts of redemptive and exciting ways.
It strikes me, right, that having a high Christology, right, taking a higher view of God is exactly the thing, and that allows you to actually be to take a lower view of human beings, right? That those two things have to kind of, well, do they have to go hand in hand? Like, I mean, I guess that's a little bit of a loaded question, but to me, it seems like they do have to go hand in hand, right? Like, or that you could if you take a lower view of human beings and you don't have a higher view of God, that's a little bit more room for, I guess, pessimism or whatever. I guess speak to that relationship a little bit.
Yeah, a low anthropology without God is can feel pretty hopeless. At the same time, I try to draw out that even if you don't believe in God, that still the testimony of the vast testimony of the human race is that I feel loved when I'm known in my weakness, not in my strength. The great testimony of, like, take God out of the equation, but love is experienced at the point of shame and weakness and guilt and simply humanity. We can feel respected or admired for our attributes and our gifts, but no one feels loved unless they're known. And what that's code for is no one feels loved unless you sort of see the real me, the me, the sweatpants me, you know, the unshaven, the kind of yelling at my kids me, you know, that has to, I will not feel loved if those things are edited out. So I think you can talk about that in terms of there is still something hopeful about a low anthropology view of the world outside of God. But that said, it becomes a much more hopeful, an extremely hopeful position once for those of us who do believe in God, because instead of a high anthropology places its hope in your or my ability to do the right thing, or to change, or to love the right people in the right way. And as we know, humans beings tend to disappoint. Like they're capable of enormous good and excitement, but if the hope for my ultimate hope lies in the human ability to sort of do the right thing, then it would seem that that's a futile hope, because we're so conflicted and we're so dragged down by so many things, and that be our past, our upbringing, our culture in which we live, the systems we are a part of, and simply our own inherited sin. But I think if you have that's where Low Anthropology tends to put hope. It's like a humanistic type thing. But a Christian humanism, which I would say allows for it says that God is the engine of goodness, truth, and beauty in the world. And it's much more hopeful because it puts hope in the person that can, or the being, or the entity that can actually do something about the problem. And so that's hopeful. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for true despair. So I do think that things go hand in hand. I tried to write the book from the vantage point of like, why would the Christian faith be of comfort, or why would it make emotional sense at all? And to me, it doesn't make much sense outside of human need. Or help. Like if we were talking about our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, well, that means that I'm a person in need of saving, and that's not a small thing to say about someone. But if you're a person who's ever been in a situation where you felt like you needed outside help or saving, then you would be very interested in someone who is called a savior. So all of this works together. As I was trying to make an emotionally intelligible case for God's grace in the lives of actual people. But to do that, I think you can get pretty far without getting to the God piece, but you can't actually get fully there. And you can certainly slip into, human beings are self-centered, therefore it's not worth trying. I heard that this morning, so someone said that to me. And I think it's less about effort than Low Anthropology is more about expectation rather than effort.
Yeah.
So I know that the context of the folks that are going to be seeing this are presumably Christian. We believe in Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. And so I was thinking, I've been thinking of that buzzword evangelism as I've been reading through your book, and as we've been talking about this connection with a high Christology and a low anthropology. So I would love to hear your take on what place practice of low anthropology perhaps can have in evangelizing, because we are called to not just keep all this stuff to ourselves, right? And so a helpful, practical, maybe not so practical, but your response to that, to this buzzword evangelize.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a person, I love evangelism because I think the gospel's actually good news. I mean, if you're trying to bait and switch someone into your own kind of program, or more statistics to, I don't know what it is. If you're trying to get them to your own ends, just to meet your own ends, then your people feel talked down to, I think patronized. A low anthropology does not, it cuts through Christian claims of superiority. I'm not actually superior to you, but that I'm simply, it's a little bit like the two beggars telling another beggar where to find bread. I think that we say that in our attempts at evangelism, but low anthropology really tries to ground that. It's like, I'm not better than you. In fact, I'm probably worse. I'm not a person who is a consistent human. Like, I'm a hypocrite. And I have been addressed by God in Jesus. And like, that is, for me, that's what keeps me hanging on. I find that to be it's not somehow I've been imbued with superpowers that make me morally superior to you. It's much more, we're on the same playing field. In fact, like, let's stop pretending that like life is easy, or that today the word is vulnerability. Let's really talk about what's going on, what it's like, what our internal life is like. And then maybe we're going to find connection at that point. That's where all connection always happens. But that's the place where I think God sort of dwells. And so I find what makes me uneasy about evangelism when I did it as a sort of a youth leader was always the sense that I was above other people. And that's what people don't like. They don't feel like feeling judged. No one likes feeling judged. But if a low anthropology says, no, as Anne Lamott says, I'm more like you than I care to believe. But I can also assume that you are struggling with things that I can't see. And that whether or not a person's ready to admit that is a completely different story. That's, I think, in God's hands. But I find it's a real bridge. It's a real bridge to other people who are in pain and who are complicit in some of their own pain or in tied in knots of their own making. This is a message that allows it makes Christianity into really great news. Not something that's a veiled superiority thing. So,
well, that gets at something I was thinking about. That is, I think you're exactly right, and yet so often people do experience or expect Christianity to be like a veiled superiority thing, right? Like that is how so many people experience church. And you write about this in the last chapter, the high anthropology and religion, or low anthropology and religion. And so one thing I've been thinking a lot about is, so in our tradition, we're Presbyterians, we come from a very kind of reformed background, and so total depravity is a big part of our tradition. Original sin, these are low anthropology doctrines. But yet, like, at the same time, I think in the modern world, the last few decades, it's not that we've dispensed with those doctrines. We just kind of either take them for granted, or we overlook them and move on to other things and don't spend a lot of time talking about it. And I think that might be because we're trying to avoid low anthropology a little bit. Like, we're afraid it's going to be off-putting, I guess, it would be helpful to hear you talk a little bit more about, okay, so how is this message about low anthropology, I mean, you've touched on all these things, but just, it strikes me that it's both different from the world around us, which kind of tells you to believe in yourself, that kind of thing, and also different from what so many people expect or experience in the church, in this kind of feeling burdened to meet certain expectations to belong to God kind of thing. Yeah. Like, there's a middle ground there that's interesting, right?
Yeah, they're both forms of high anthropology. I think a lot of what people have heard growing up, or just in a kind of a caricatured version of Christianity, which is out there in spades, let me tell you, is a sort of, you're a miserable sinner, now stop being that, and like, just really stop, like, stop now. Why do you keep doing that? Stop it. And that's kind of like and then that creates shame and self-loathing. Low anthropology says that, in fact, that's not a low enough, that sounds like a low anthropology, but it attributes to Christians an enormous amount of, I would call it just agency or superpower. A low anthropology says you are, yes, you are made in the image of God, but you are a person who is flawed in all sorts of ways and in need of help from the outside. More than that, you're in need of deliverance from God. And the good news of the gospel is that God takes that seriously. He takes sin seriously. He takes damage seriously. He takes justice seriously, so seriously that here's Jesus Christ, who was, everyone bailed on, and yet he does not turn his face away and sort of sees us at our worst and is kind of keeps coming. So I would say that most of the time, I mean, it's easy for me to think about it in terms of the way I grew up. Although I grew up in a Christian home, it was a sort of mainline church, and I went to prep schools that told me that I was very special, and like that I was really great, and really emphasized the goodness, and sort of was probably in reaction to some of the historical kind of lowly worm type of Protestantism, but said, you were, this is up to you. You've been given every gift. Now it's time to go out there and like change the world and heal the world. And it sounds great when you're 16, and then when you're 25 and you're like, well, that I keep screwing up, or I can't even like wake up on time, and all of a sudden you think you're the only person who's that, or that you were lied to. And this is Lori Gottlieb in her wonderful book, You Should Talk to Someone, talks about how so many people come into her office and are like, I with all this shame, because they're like, I think I'm the only one. I'm not capable of the stuff I was told I was capable of. And they're unable to experience love, and they just feel nothing but self-condemnation. So there's a key line in the book that I actually stole from Nadia Bolz-Weber, who said that it's not shame-inducing and defeating to say that I cannot do it all, know it all, care about it all, control it all. It's shame-inducing and defeating to say that I can, I just haven't pulled it off yet. Like that's where you pit a person against themselves. And so there's a secular version of it, and there's a Christian version of it, but it's the same thing. A low anthropology says, while good things are going to happen through me and to me, God is going to be the engine of those things, and love, to the extent that I experience, will somehow be found in these experiences of shortcoming and lack, and that's what's transformative, rather than the avoidance of them. And that's a countercultural statement, but it's borne out in our lives, and I think it's borne out in Christians' lives. I mean, the path of sanctification is so often a path into deeper dependence on God, not somehow an independence whereby I no longer need God. You read the testimony of the saints, and whether that be Frederick Buechner, or whether that be Mother Teresa, or whether that, Billy Graham, Dorothy Day, I don't know who it is, they all get to the end of their lives feeling like an awareness of their own smallness. And they never got to a place where they needed God less. In fact, they got to a deeper awareness of just how much they need God. And that's where the serenity, and that's where the compassion for other people, and that's where the reaching out, it comes. And it's just beautiful to see. And if you've ever been around someone who's got that kind of aroma, that it's intoxicating, and it's not self-aggrandizing. It's the very opposite of that. And it can't be contrived.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. This is a needle, right? That's like, it's both really easy to thread, and it's really easy to just slightly tweak it, and it changes. So like, I'll give you an example. Ben and I are in this preaching program together, and last week we were helping a colleague kind of work through a potential sermon series about enoughness.
Oh yeah.
And she was like kind of trying to craft a statement about it. We were all trying to kind of help her. And it was like, the world tells you, that you are not beautiful enough, rich enough, kind enough, smart enough, all these other things. But then at the end, they wanted to say, but because of God, you are enough. And we had to go, wait, hold on a second. No, it's more like, just in the eyes of God, you are enough. It's not that you are enough because God makes you enough. That still is high anthropology, right? Like, let's just pause. No, it's just God sees you, and to God you are enough, and that is enough, right? It was just a great, and in that moment, it was a great example of like how those two messages are there's a real needle to be thread there, right? That you have to make sure you thread correctly.
Yeah, because the world just wants to shout at you. Like a certain, like, sort of self-help gurus want to shout, "No, you are enough. Don't you get it? You are enough."
Right.
If you don't hear it, just turn up the volume on it, and you experience yourself, and you're like, "Well, wait a second. Even independent of the voices of the condemnation I received in my childhood, like, I know what I'm like. I know the shortcuts I go through, and I know that I leave something to be desired when it comes to complete honesty with other people, and then I'm always trying to spin my own image, and so the enough thing is so great, because it's such a good euphemism for righteousness, and like it's the now we don't want to say, it's not like a new way of saying, no, you're terrible or something like that. That's what the non, I would call a legalistic gospel would say, like, well, you can be enough if you just pray harder, or that God can help you to be enough. What I believe what the message of the New Testament is that God gives you his enoughness. Like you are covered in it. You are still in most ways your same person, and yet ultimately you have been given imputed. You've been imputed.
Imputation. Yeah.
Imputation. And that somehow applies in some way that I can't fully understand. That somehow applies to me. That enoughness applies to me when it comes to God. And that is miraculous. And out of that, I no longer need to jockey for or establish or earn my enoughness. I can start to find that I can love my neighbor in new and creative ways, because I'm not looking for them to be a prop in my story of self-justification. Yeah, so enough has become, I use that word a lot in I wrote a book called Seculosity, and I use that word a lot because I think it's a helpful euphemism for righteousness. But I don't think the Christian view of just saying, no, you suck, or the world's version of just being like, no, you are enough. What I want is a candid and honest place to acknowledge my lack of enoughness, and to hear that God treats me differently than I treat myself or than the world treats me on that basis. And in fact, he has given me the gift of his righteousness.
Yeah.
And that's a beautiful thing. I think that's the striving cease, and all of a sudden you can do things for not because you have to, but because you want to.
All right, you've sort of answered this, so I'm going to push you on this. And this is a question from a member of our church at Howard Memorial. And this is a question: how does one embrace a low anthropology when one has been programmed, educated, guided in the other direction for their entire lives? And this is a individual who's retired. So you were sharing a little bit about sort of taking steps back, but are there other suggestions, other comments about how does one become low anthropology when they've been programmed, trained, educated to be high anthropology, because that worked?
Well, again, it kind of depends on what we're meaning when we say you've been trained to be high anthropology, because no one can have the imperfection trained out of them. That's not right. They're still very much themselves, and talk to the person they live with and you'll find a litany of things that is still irritating or imperfect or simply just needy about them. Well, I think if we're talking about expectations of other people, and we have this is where people get nervous, because it's like, are you saying I should never have any expectations that people are good or nice and I think on the one hand we could do with a little less expectation. I want to say our problem in 21st century America and 21st century American Christianity is not that we have too low of expectations. It's just our issues are burnout, that's and loneliness, and everyone thinks they're the only one who's struggling. And I don't think that inflated expectations are truly pernicious and toxic to love. At least it may, again, really high expectations can produce a Tiger Woods. It can produce a Steve Maravich or something like that. I'm using sports metaphors, but except no flaw will have a short-term upshot. Right. Whether or not it has staying power is a totally different question. In fact, it seems to produce the exact opposite in the long term. And you find people who grew up with quote unquote really high standards come to resent their parents tremendously, or just move as far away from them as they can possibly get. Yeah. And I don't think that that's just but there is such a thing as, I think there can be a way of expectations, back to the imposter syndrome thing. I was thinking about how in that article, they interview some people of color, and they're sort of like, we didn't deal with imposter syndrome. What we got was people expected. So these women were like a Black lady at IBM was saying, people expected so little of me that I had to constantly be showing them that I'm actually capable of good things. In that sense, her to receive some expectation that she's just as capable as anyone else, that would be love, that she would receive that not as crushing demand. She would receive that as an invitation to achievement and dignity. It's things like that. So I think that that's like an important, there's some things are a little dynamic, I guess you could say. Like there's truths here, but it's not like a one size fits all sort of thing. But the person who's has been completely programmed into high anthropology, I think I would just invite them to examine their own relationships and find the people that they're excited to share good news with, or the ones that they care about the most. I guarantee you, they've in some sense they're accepting of they have either felt accepted by those people in their weakness, or they have been accepting of outside of high anthropology. So I don't know if you can actually be completely trained out of it. You can certainly have less tolerance for other people's shortcomings, but again, to live inside that headspace is like you have ultimately it's sort of hell, because you have the real person you have the least tolerance for is yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
Have you seen have you watched any of the new Netflix series about the PGA Tour yet? Full Swing. Have you caught it yet?
I have.
It's got all of this stuff in it. Like I just started it yesterday, and it's got all of this stuff in it, from just high expectations of oneself to like even Scotty Scheffler is, a person of faith, and he talks about all that. And then you've got Joel Diamond struggling with imposter syndrome, and it's all there. It's just amazing.
That's why golf is so interesting to people, and it's needed to be shown to me, because I didn't grow up playing golf, and I don't really play golf, but the internal head games that people play, it's like tennis. Because those guys did a tennis documentary too, and I love it.
Awesome.
And it's all sort of, do I deserve to be here? Like, what if I can't perform this time? And in golf, it's like every single shot feels like that. In tennis, it's more fluid, I guess, but it's fascinating how these dynamics play out. And I would just say, like, low anthropology is not in any way opposed to achievement. It's I try to talk about all the wonderful low anthropology. Like again, you can appreciate the amount of beauty and goodness, and it says that people are gifted in all sorts of really cool and creative ways. It says that, but low anthropology also says that that's not the whole truth about us.
Right.
And you can love me for the holes and ones that I get, but I tell you what, if that's the only reason you love me, you're not going to love me very long,
Right.
Well,
I have to bring in
ahead,
another genre. You're throwing out all this. I watch sports. I play sports. All right, guys. But Bridgerton is an excellent example of expectations, right? And I mean, in all seriousness, though, it gives us an example of people who live in their own cultural niches, right? So their ability to practice low anthropology is going to look different from someone who lives perhaps in a different caste. I mean, folks that experience all these different expectations, as you give the example of the woman of color working for IBM. So I don't know if this is a fair question to ask, but can low anthropology work with folks that live in completely different worlds? And how does that span the divide, the gap?
I mean, I think it's our only hope for spanning the gap, because it says that no matter the systemic challenges, and that I cannot fully understand your upbringing or the challenges you've had. Say I'm talking to a woman of color who grew up in a very different context than I did. But I guarantee you, we will if she's able to share with me and I'm able to share with her the fact that my mother got sick and it was very scary, she will be able to say, well, I had the same thing happen to me. And you can find touchstones, usually the point of pain. And all of a sudden we can really talk. That doesn't mean that I can fill in the blanks and know for certain what I can assume, though, that no matter who it is, whether they appear to be perfect to me or if they appear to be completely disastrous to me, I can assume that they are in struggle. They're walking through quicksand just like I am. And that I think gives me a starting point of love rather than suspicion. Or and maybe that's naive, and this is not what people would say, but like it makes you suspicious of yourself, low anthropology, but it makes you generous towards other people, because you think that alienating behavior or that thing that I think is so just off-putting about them, odds are if I knew them better, I wouldn't feel as off. The only reason I think that person is better or worse than me, in other words, is that I don't know them very well. And so a low anthropology, I think, is an invitation not only to like friendship and collaboration, and like I have a blind spot. Like a low anthropology also says that I have blind spots. Like I cannot know what it was like to grow up in that context, just like she cannot know what it was like to grow up in my context. And we both want to minimize each other's suffering or sort of moralize the situation. But in fact, I need her, and she might even need me, because we're incomplete. And again, other people become an opportunity for collaboration and friendship and love, rather than a threat or somehow a direct contradiction of my own experience. I think that there's all sorts of different ways that we can get down to it. But I know that when I find people crossing racial divides, the most difficult ones, and gender divides and generational divides, and there's just we could name divides all day, but usually it has to begin with the recognition of our common humanity, and our common humanity is never found in our common strength. It just is found in our common weakness, and a lot of that has to do with loss. Like we both experience loss in certain ways. All of a sudden, once I find out what that person's lost, and I know my own, then I have a crack opens, or I can know that they have different virtues or values than I do, but I know that we both don't live up to our values perfectly. And then all of a sudden another crack opens, and sooner rather than later, you're seeing a person who's kind of different than you, but also very similar, and then you can work together and maybe benefit from each other's, because we have different gifts. We have very similar weaknesses, but I think we have different gifts.
Sounds like the need to lift the veil, a revelation is called for.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really true. I think that, like, I use it in the book, but certainty, the idea of certainty when it comes to yourself, when it comes to other people, when it comes to issues, when it comes to theology, even, like, can be it shuts down conversation, and it's a high anthropology mode of living. A low anthropologist can say, I'm pretty sure about this, or I'm pretty convicted about this. I feel strongly about this, but I can never be 100% certain, because I'm not God. Like, I just don't have access to all the facts. And I believe that opens the door to dialogue with anyone, rather than shuts it in the face of, I don't need to talk about to this person because I already know what they're going to say. I don't need to talk to this whole category of people. And I hear people of color say that about other white people, and I hear white people say that about people of color. Like, it goes both ways. It's a very human. In fact, we're unified in our intolerance of other people. But if I can say that I cannot know for certain what you're going to say, I cannot know for certain what you've had to deal with, well, then curiosity is a fruit, right? Like, yeah. Maybe God put this person in my life for a reason, and I've got something to learn. I think that's an invitation to life becomes one big surprise party.
Yeah, Eugene Peterson, I think, said, in the company of Jesus, there's no experts. There can be no experts, which I love that.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah. It's a good quote along those lines. Well, so I think we've been going for about 35 minutes here. I guess we could, I'll pitch a couple more to you, and we want to give you a chance at the end to just tell people a little bit more about Mockingbird in particular, just because we have some people in our church that are listeners and other people who would have no familiarity to that at all. Maybe before we did that, real quick, just a real basic question that I think came from Meg's church, which I think is a great question, because I think this is the big hang up for a lot of people. But it's, if low anthropology is accurate and people are really limited and failures, like, what's the point of trying at all? You've touched on this a little bit, but how would you succinctly respond to that? That there's an assumption there about cynicism, a cynical assumption about people, I guess.
Yeah, again, I would just punt back to certainty, and like a certain low anthropology is not synonymous with cynicism to the extent that it holds the door open for possibility. High anthropology shuts that door. It says, I know for certain that these people aren't capable of that, and those people are, and these are the good kinds of people, and those are the bad. And for certain, the low anthropology says, it says, good people are capable of terrible things, and terrible people are capable of great things. And like any survey of art in the throughout the centuries, or just simply Hollywood is kind of proves that. So I think that there's a sense in which to try to be a person, a low anthropologist in God's world, is to again be surprised. It's the opposite of entitlement, and high anthropologist is entitled and it's kind of resentful. Like, why isn't the world better? Why isn't the world better than it is? Why aren't other people better than they like? Why aren't they more like me? And a low anthropologist says, like, given what people are like and what I've been like to other people, what other people have been like to me, wow, God is at work in the world, and acts of love and charity happen with alarming frequency, such that I want to stick around and see what happens next. And the human beings are capable of creating something as extremely funny and perfectly humorous as Seinfeld. And yet the content of that show is that people are inhuman to one another. And so it's like both of these things can exist at the same time. So I think that I think a low anthropology also really does say that God is the whole truth about you is not just that you're a failure. The whole truth about you is that you have been given enormous gifts. There's kind of sometimes a shadow side to certain gifts, but like part of the excitement of living in God's world is to see how God's going to use those gifts, and to not highlight the fact in ways that we've been treated with enormous and experienced beauty in all sorts of cool ways. That's not low anthropology. Yeah. We must highlight those things and be like, we move into the world with awe and wonder rather than resentment and entitlement. A high anthropologist says human beings are good, getting better. So why aren't they getting better? And why am I not, why aren't people treating me better? And so you have a chip on your shoulder and everyone's failing you all the time. A low anthropologist says, wow, it's amazing to see how much good things have flown my way in spite of the fact that we're all so complicated and conflicted. And I don't know. I think it's an encouragement to use the gifts God has given you, and knowing that they can be of use to other people too. And that because we're incomplete, someone needs your gifts just like you need someone else's. I like the Christian imagery is always of the body and of different parts functioning together. Like I don't think that's not in any way mutually exclusive for the low anthropology. If anything, it says you are limited. You're good at some things and you're not going to be good at other things. And like, my brother's got great spatial awareness, so I'll have him pack the car while I, play with the kids because he's at his wit's end and doesn't have much of an inner child, that sort of thing. Yeah. Like it's,
Is that a true story for you, Dave?
Both of us have great inner children, but I would say that like I've noticed in certain families certain people are good at certain things, and it all works best when we're able to appreciate the gifts other people have been given rather than blame them for the ones that they haven't been given.
Well, one thing about the question that struck me is it's very similar in its own way to a question I get all the time as a preacher who preaches the grace of God for all people at all times, which is like, so if God forgives us no matter what, then what's the point, right? If God forgives our failures no matter what, then what's the point? What's stopping me from, doing whatever I want? And my answer to that is always, it's gratitude. I mean, if you really understand the depth of your own need for forgiveness, for grace, and for mercy, and you can then trust that it's been given to you, if you can really, in the moments where we can really grasp that as people, you can't help but want to then be grateful and show your gratitude by trying to use what gifts God has given you or what you have to give thanks back to God.
I think that's so great. I mean, gratitude is reflexive, right? That's what you just described. It's not contrived. As anyone who's had children knows, if I tell you, you must say thank you, like, oh, thank you. You know, it's you want actual non-contrived love and gratitude. And the way that happens is usually through some experience of grace or being loved first. And I'm with you. I think that if the only reason you were doing good things in the first place was out of fear, then that probably comes across eventually.
Well, and it's also,
or obligation.
If Jesus lived a selfless life, let's just use that word, selfless, and we're supposed to follow Jesus and live a selfless life. If we're going out and we're trying to serve other people, but we're doing it because we're afraid of what God's going to do to us or what the punishment might be, we're not really being selfless. If we're going out and we're doing it because we want to earn our way into heaven and earn rewards, we're not really being selfless. The only way you can really be selfless is in gratitude for what you've already received and already been given, which is the promise that it's yours no matter what. That actually is the thing that frees you to actually go out and be truly selfless, like in small ways. I mean, none of us are perfect at it, but to actually be able to go forth and give of yourself without expectation of anything in return, because you've already been given everything up front.
I love that. I mean, Jesus, God's interested in the heart. Jesus talks about it all the time. I think doing the right thing for the wrong reason is the same thing. Unfortunately, in the Sermon on the Mount, it's basically the same thing as doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason. He's after people doing the right thing for the right reason. And, you know, your kid calling you every week, not to get money and for you to pay their insurance, but because they love you. And you can tell the difference. And most people will just be like, well, I just want them to call me no matter what. But the times when they've had some sort of experience of another person and be like, oh my gosh, my parents are fantastic. I can't wait to catch up with them this weekend. Or like, that reminds me of some great experience we had when we were kids. Like, then you call and there's like a overflowing blessing that occurs through that phone connection, and everyone is sort of filled up, and there's like it's just contagious. That's the overflowing fountain is kind of how I would put it. And it's not the result of being told. This is the Christian ethics are beautiful, but they're also frustrating because they're mainly spontaneous. And it's the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. But we've all know it's possible because most of us at least have been the recipients of something like it.
Yeah.
And when we have, it changes you. You're never the same. When kindness for kindness sake occurs in your own life. I was just reading another thing about Fred Rogers. I mean, there he has a Presbyterian saint right there. He did not equate his thinking of himself as the greatest person on earth. He was in touch with what it meant to be a child. He was in touch with his own, he was not self-aggrandizing in the slightest. In fact, what distinguished him was his ability to get down to the level of children. In the level of children, he treated them as people. And there was always like a sense of which he wasn't doing things in order to be seen. He was actually kind of operating out of an overflow that he always attributes to God in this kind of culturally slightly inconvenient way, but it's beautiful to see. And we know it when we see it. And it's like people just cry talking about Mr. Rogers because of that.
Yeah, you saw how Ben got choked up when you mentioned.
I mean, you brought up Fred Rogers, and I, started crying. I started taking off my cardigan, and ready to go, man.
Well, thank God for Fred Rogers. And yet, I'm sure he had his days, his high anthropology days. But occasionally God just gives us someone like that that's just pure grace.
Yes.
And we can just all we do is sit back and receive it. And like, there's no reason why why the public access television in America had to have that and not something stupid,
Right.
For gratuity. And I can look at that, and instead of resenting, children's programming for not being more like Fred Rogers. I can be grateful for the fact that there was one, and that it seems to have permeated the lives of so many people, when there's no reason why that had to be outside of the grace of God.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I want, anybody got any other questions? I want, before I kind of pitch it about Mockingbird, anybody got anything else?
I do. I want to ask you this question that is, I think my people will care. I think our people will care. But what has been the response to the book, and has any of it surprised you? You talked a lot about Low Anthropology as surprise, but like, what has been? And the book has been out since November. Am I right in that?
September.
So I mean, it's been around for a while. You've done you've been out and about. Like, what's been the response to the book, and then what out of that has surprised you?
The response has largely been really, really positive and life-changing. People saying, like, the response I get that I love the most is people saying, I want to give this to so-and-so, I want to give this to so-and-so. And I don't think it's the equivalent of giving them like a stick of deodorant. I really think it's like, this kind of explains me. Like, it's like when people get really into the Enneagram, and they're like, the way that sort of most personality tests have always been told you how great you are, but an Enneagram will always tell you sort of all the places where you're completely dysfunctional, and like you give that to someone and they're like, oh, now I get it. I think that I want it to have that, like, this hopefully explains me, but also maybe explains this weird, wacky faith that I have, and why I consider Jesus Christ to be so compelling, or God to be a necessity or urgent need in the world. That's what I love. I haven't gotten the pushback. It comes always from Christians. It's not to the extent that, I mean, I think that secular folks don't engage, or they tend to find it refreshing. I think one of the reasons I wrote the book was there was this cultural moment where everyone was talking about vulnerability, partly due to Brene Brown, who's not an entirely secular person. She's a churchgoer and everything, but I saw this enormous hunger for people to tell the truth about themselves, and the kind of weight of cultural perfectionism have been really bearing down on people, and not just women, but men too. And I wanted to write a book that sort of spoke to that hunger, but also with not just with transparency, but also with absolution, or forgiveness.
Yeah.
And the hope of God. And not to say that that's not in there. I just wanted to go a little further in those books. So I found that to be the case in most receptions of Low Anthropology. There's some people who wish the book was more theological, like that there's a chapter on religion in there, and I get the sense that there's some of my readers would have liked that to be the whole book.
Right.
But there's lots of good books that address that particularly. I wanted to cast a wider net, and if in doing that I cast a narrower net, I hope I didn't. But I think I'd like to think it'll have some legs. But by and large, I get people being like, "Thank you so much for writing this. This is so helpful to me." And can we get together and talk about some of this? It opens conversations rather than shuts them down. I've had people left, right, center, men, women, black, white, all sorts of everyone across the spectrum has found something in there, I think, that can be helpful.
It's definitely a unifying message. I mean, and that's Christianity ought to be a unifying message. But what you've done is identified it. I mean, I think when you speak about universal suffering, and that people are acting out of that in this way, and identifying that as the part of Christianity that allows it to be unifying, and we can take that for granted. We can avoid that maybe in our churches more than we should, and in our own spiritual lives more than we should. And I think the book has been a great call back to reminding us of that, which is perfect for Lent, right? What we're trying to do with Lent.
I wish I mean, there's a paperback edition coming out. The only thing I would shift if I could. I'd like to just highlight the role of the Holy Spirit a little bit more for Christians.
Sure.
The power of God. And, like when we talk about hope, and we talk about why try it all, or we talk about God's work in the world, I mean, I think that's the realm of the Holy Spirit. And I think a low anthropology, if you don't have some, yes, a high Christology, but also what theologians would call like a robust pneumatology, an idea that God's Spirit is active and at work in unlikely places and through broken vessels and through, the cracks are where the light gets in and all that stuff. I wish I have it in a footnote in there, but it deserved to be in the main text, and I regret that. I don't know what, and I did have one person say that to me, and I said, no, it's there in a footnote, but that's not good enough.
Well, what did you say? You're a man of many regrets. So,
oh gosh, so many. But I don't regret coming on and talking to you guys. This has been so flattering and fun.
This has been awesome.
This has been a blast for us. So,
well, plug Mockingbird for us. I mean, so like I said, we've got some people in our church that are listeners. We did a thing a couple of years ago where we had a group of people read through the Mockingbird devotional, and they really, really loved it. But for people who have no idea what that is, tell us what it is and how it might help their spiritual lives.
Oh, thank you, Howard. Mockingbird, at this point, it's a platform for talking about grace and everyday life and God's grace and how it relates to you and me, and how that, maybe that everything we've talked about on this little video, I would say we're trying to bring to bear in fresh and creative ways. And it's a host of different contributors from all across the sort of Christian world. But we have podcasts, and we have a very beautiful print magazine. We have this will air, the sickness and health issue is about to come out. It's our 22nd issue. We do conferences, and we have a very active web presence and social media. So it's kind of started as an attempt to kind of go online with ministry, and it is blossomed into this very cool creative outlet for people who are interested in getting back to Christianity as good news in non-embarrassing ways, but also ones that hopefully take God seriously and ourselves not seriously, and sort of have a kind of emanate hope and love in a world that is, I think, full of despair. So that's Mockingbird for you. I do a podcast called the Mockingcast, which people seem to enjoy, with my friend Sarah and my friend RJ. They're both ordained Episcopal ministers. I'm not. Mockingbird is not denominationally affiliated, but that comes out every 2 weeks, and you can find that wherever you get your podcasts. And then our website is mbird.com. That's mbird.com. And there's a host. We've published, 30, 40 books over the years, and just trying to provide resources for folks who want a kind of a substantial but playful and accessible expression of the Christian faith, as it that doesn't feel overly partisan or timely, but that it has a sense of humor and really points to Jesus as the friend of sinners, of real people.
Well, that's fantastic, man. I cannot recommend it enough. It has been I tell people it's been a breath of fresh air to me, and I've had other people kind of say the same thing. Y'all do a really great job. This book does a really great job of, I think, helping people kind of grasp a kind of Christianity that is good news, that feels like good news and not overbearing, which it so often can be to both people who have kind of left the church and people in the church and people who are struggling with the church. Like I find it to be extremely refreshing and theologically rich. I mean, it's just so you do a great job of reclaiming and applying doctrine today for us today. And that's a lot of people don't love the word doctrine because it feels overbearing, but you kind of have helped me see it as a way that grounds us a little bit better. And I'm deeply grateful for that. So, and grateful for what you've given to our churches without even knowing it. So,
amen.
Thank you, man.
Howard, thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Ben.
You're welcome. Thank you for your time. And one last question that a member of my church did want me to ask is, when is your next book coming out?
Oh, that's sweet. Well, it's got to be written first. I have a contract for it, so I'm on the hook.
Okay.
but I've been traveling so much for this that I needed to take a break and let it settle a little bit. But I'm hoping 2025 will be another book.
Well, excellent. Well, we look forward to that, man.
Yeah,
I got some ideas, but who knows? Maybe the Lord's got it. I'm not certain about anything.
Yeah. Good.
Hey-o.
Let the Holy Spirit unleashed.
Yes, that's the prayer. That's always.
Oh man. Well, thank you so much for taking time to chat with a bunch of Presbyterians in North Carolina. We are deeply grateful for you doing this and for writing the book. So thank you. It's
My pleasure.
Yeah, we appreciate